I'm here to talk to you about media and climate change. Media coverage of climate change has become something of a perfect storm of miscommunication, with a number of factors converging to frustrate rational public discussion on the topic. Public opinion polling on climate change indicates that while most Australians do accept that anthropogenic climate change is happening, there's declining public preparedness to accept the cost of action on climate change, even as scientists warn us of the increasing urgency for such action. This is a problem because governments are unlikely to continue acting against climate change unless there's public support. The first contributing factor relates to the disjuncture between the working practices of scientists and journalists. Scientific research generally takes place over weeks, months, years, even decades. This is in stark comparison to the 24/7 news cycle within which journalists work. Scientific research findings are generally reported in percentage terms of probability, not as finite facts. And this is a problem for journalists who generally prefer easily communicable truths. And it's a source of some frustration for both groups that journalists are continually seeking definite forecasts and predictions about the effects of climate change. The second contributing factor relates to certain journalism norms and conventions. Professional journalism evolved around an ethos of representing truth accurately and fairly, with fairness generally conceived in terms of objectivity and balance, of representing all sides without bias. Over time, balance has come to be viewed as representing both sides, as if there are only ever two sides to an issue. And this has contributed to the debate framing, which we've seen so much of in the media's coverage of climate change, with a tiny group of climate deniers balanced alongside a very large group of climate scientists. Something like 93% of the world's climate scientists subscribe to anthropogenic climate change. So we're seeing a distortion of reality in the interests of providing balance. News values is another aspect of journalism conventions that's affected media coverage of climate change. These are the criteria that news media apply in ascertaining the newsworthiness of a topic. Negativity, cultural proximity, reference to elite persons, reference to elite nations, and conflict are some of the news values that are applied. Certainly, when matched with controversy, conflict is a great way of making eye-catching headlines, and it meshes well with the debate framing that we've seen in media coverage of climate change, with conflictual debates about whether or not climate change is happening and whether or not governments should intervene to act against climate change. The third contributing factor in this perfect storm of miscommunication relates to the funding crisis in print journalism, generally discussed in terms of the loss of the rivers of gold, the loss of classified advertising revenue. This has occurred, of course, with the emergence of the online platform and new specialist providers such as drive.com and mycareer.com, which offer interactive tools that hard copy really can't compete with. Alongside the loss of this revenue stream, there's been, of course, a whole new range of competitors arise in the online platform. Citizen media, new professional specialist online news media, and the online cannibals, search engines that offer customised news services, cannibalising the news produced by others. The combination of this loss of revenue and new range of competitors has amplified the effects of the 24/7 news cycle. Breaking news, the reporting of gossipers' news. Journalism, the recycling of media releases without due fact-checking. The blurring of gossip, opinion and reportage as journalism with the integration of social media into mainstream news organisations. And the displacement of truth, accuracy and fairness with speed and currency as the driving principles of news, all of which have contributed to a decline in public interest journalism. The fourth contributing factor relates to the disproportionate coverage given to climate deniers, whose rebuttal of internationally renowned climate scientists and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change offer a titillating spectacle to many. The arguments of climate deniers generally follow three trends: an inversion of reality in which they represent legitimate climate science as junk science in order to better validate the claims of climate denialism as true science. The claim that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a conspiracy for world government, a plot to control us all. And the claim that climate scientists only subscribe to anthropogenic climate change in order to attract funding for their research. A claim that's somewhat ironic given the amount of revenue that flows from the coffers of the mining and resources sector into the pockets of climate deniers. In fact, comparisons are often made with the way the campaign operated by the British American Tobacco Company to suppress the links between smoking and lung cancer. In the US, the Heartland Institute brokers between climate deniers and those vested interests that are threatened by action on climate change. The fifth and last contributing factor in this perfect storm of miscommunication relates to the way that politics and economics dominate public conversation on climate change to the exclusion of the environment. And this is because front page news is hard news, and hard news is political and economic news. And what we see here is a two-speed conversation on climate change, because the mainstream newspapers, mostly in our country, do employ specialist environmental journalists who do report on the environment, but their reports tend to be buried on the inside pages. And so they report on the latest findings of climate science research and the various social, environmental and economic impacts of global warming. But these stories, as I said, tend not to make it to the front page. On the front page we get political games and the leadership horse race in the reporting of climate change policy. And this is because political journalists tend to position themselves as political insiders and report on the machinations of policy making rather than on the purpose of that policy or the research behind it. And so we get coverage such as the July controversy, in which the leader of the opposition represented the PM's retreat from a pre-election promise as a lie rather than as a simple matter-of-fact political negotiation in the securing minority government. On October 2011, the day the carbon price legislation was passed, we got a new twist in the leadership horse race framing on climate change. Most of our mainstream media led with the story of Julia Gillard kissing Kevin Rudd, that other internal leadership horse race. Not the fact that this landmark legislation was actually going to drive our national economy towards a cleaner, greener future. So where can you get better information about climate change? Well, you might start with the stories by those environmental journalists buried on the inside pages, or you could go to some of these sites. These are government and organisations that I suggest offer reliable and relevant information. And when you find a story or even a cartoon that you think is important, that speaks to you, I suggest you share it on your social networks and make yourself an environmental communications channel. And in this way you can contribute to bridging this two-speed conversation on climate change and also help to diversify the public discussion.